The Phantom Ghost. Part 1. What they saw. The footage was 37 seconds long. The officer had watched it 11 times. He sat alone in a room with no windows. Fluorescent light humming above a metal table, a cup of coffee gone cold at his elbow. On the screen in front of him, a timestamp read 14:23 on a Tuesday afternoon in October. The location tag said San Antonio, Texas. The camera angle was high and slightly tilted a security mount above a firearms range, the kind that usually captured nothing more dramatic than a man adjusting his ear protection or arguing about target placement. What it captured instead was a woman. She was not tall. She was not young. She moved with the careful economy of someone whose body had developed strong opinions about certain positions over a long period of time, and she wore a denim jacket that had seen better decades. Her hair was silver, cut short and practical. Her right hand, even from this angle, even in the compressed resolution of a commercial security feed, it shook. Not violently, not in the way of fear or cold, a steady rhythmic tremor like a metronome set to a tempo only she could hear. The officer watched her kneel. He watched her settle the rifle. He watched her breathe. The first shot hit the target dead center. The target was a silver dollar coin suspended on fishing line, turning slowly in the recycled air of an indoor range. The coin rang like a bell, sound the microphone barely captured, but which was visible in the involuntary flinch of every person standing behind the observation glass. The second shot split it. The third shot, and this was the part the officer leaned forward for every single time he reached it, the third shot she closed her eyes, and what remained of that coin simply ceased to exist. 37 seconds. He reached forward and typed a single line into the search field, connected to a database that most people did not know existed. The cursor blinked in the fluorescent light. He had been doing this work for 19 years, and he had learned to trust the specific quality of feeling that settled in his chest when he had seen something that mattered. He felt it now. Find out who she is. He pressed send and leaned back in his chair, and for the first time in a long while, he felt something he could not immediately name. The timestamp on the footage read 48 hours ago. He was still waiting for an answer. The morning had started the way most Tuesday mornings started for Helen Carter. She woke at 5:15 without an alarm. Made coffee in a kitchen that was clean but not warm functional, the way a campsite is functional with everything you need and nothing you don't. Drank it standing at the window watching the pre-dawn sky over San Antonio shift from black to the deep bruised purple that came just before the city remembered it existed. A freight train moved somewhere south of her neighborhood, its rhythm low and distant, the kind of sound that belonged to early morning, the way certain smells belong to seasons. She checked her right hand the way she always checked it, held it out in front of her palm, down fingers extended, and watched the tremor move through it. The neurologist had explained it many times with words that sounded like apology. Permanent peripheral nerve damage, progressive but stable, the result of sustained trauma to the median and ulnar nerve pathways. Helen had nodded through all of it. She had her own explanation, shorter and more accurate, though she kept it to herself. She had earned this. In the breast pocket of her jacket next to her sternum, there was a coin. It was the size of a quarter but heavier, worn smooth on both faces from years of handling. The eagle on one side was barely visible, now the unit insignia on the other, just a ghost of raised metal. Master Sergeant Joseph Carter had carried that coin through 23 years of service, through the Saudi desert in August of 1990, and through the burning oil fields that came after through Tehran, and the nights before the ground campaign began, when the waiting was its own kind of difficult, through places that didn't appear on the maps he was given, and decisions that never made it into any official record. He had come home from Desert Storm with the same precise quietness with which he had left, which was the quality his daughter had inherited most completely, the ability to be in a room and present to it without requiring the room to acknowledge the presence. He had kept his counsel about most of those places. He had kept his counsel about most things in the way of men who understood that the things which mattered most were not improved by excessive discussion. He had pressed it into Helen's hand 3 years ago in a hospital room in San Antonio, while a monitor beside him recorded the slow arithmetic of his heartbeat. His hand around hers had been dry and very still, steadier in those last weeks than hers had been in years, which was either irony or instruction, depending on how you chose to look at it. He had looked at her with the particular attention of a man taking careful note of a situation he would not see resolved. She had made him 2 promises before she left that room. The first was that she would not go back. Not to that world, not to those rooms with no windows, not to the specific and total clarity that came with looking through a scope at something 400 meters away and knowing with a certainty she had never found anywhere else in her life exactly what she was doing and why. She had promised him she was finished with it. The second promise was simpler. She had promised to come home. She touched the coin once through the fabric of her jacket. Then she picked up the rifle case from beside the door, drove 16 minutes through lighted traffic, and parked in front of Lone Star Arms on Commerce Street just as they were turning the sign to open. The scope needed adjustment. Nothing more than that. She had calculated it would take 20 minutes. Lone Star Arms was the kind of establishment that took itself seriously. The display cases were lit from below each weapon, positioned with the careful presentation of a museum exhibit. Angles, precise finishes, gleaming the implicit message being that these were not objects for amateurs. The walls held framed photographs and commendations, a mounted buck in the corner, a glass case of challenge coins and unit patches behind the register. The carpet was dark and the lighting warm, and the whole operation carried the organized, purposeful atmosphere of a place run by someone who knew exactly what they were doing and expected everyone else to keep up. That someone was Walt Greer, 45 years old, a haircut that had not changed since his second deployment, forearms that spoke to a decade of carrying weight through difficult terrain, and another 7 years of restoring old rifles in the back of a shop that kept him honest about the patience the work required. He had managed Lone Star Arms since retiring from the Marine Corps with the quiet efficiency of a man who had learned early that most problems were smaller than they appeared, and the ones that weren't had already resolved themselves before you heard about them. He was in the back office at 9:14, working through a consignment intake, when the bell above the front door announced a new customer. His assistant, Garrett Nolan, was behind the counter. Garrett was 25 years old and had worked at Lone Star Arms for 8 months, which in his assessment was sufficient time to have developed a comprehensive understanding of the firearms industry and the people who moved through it. He had strong opinions about ammunition, about training, philosophies, about terminal ballistics, and the particular category of customer who wandered in off the street with a vague idea and an inflated sense of their own expertise. He held these opinions with the confidence of someone who had not yet had occasion to test them against the full range of what the world contained. He communicated them through a specific kind of smile, pleasant on the surface, a door shut quietly behind the eyes. He watched the woman come in, and the smile settled into its working position. Silver hair, denim jacket with the particular soft wear of something laundered many times without much ceremony. Canvas bag over one shoulder, a rifle case in her left hand, her right hand hanging loose at her side with a visible tremor that moved through it in that slow measured rhythm. Sneakers that had put in serious mileage. She looked like someone's aunt. She looked like someone who had meant to turn left several blocks ago and was too proud to admit it. Behind Garrett in the corner near the ammunition display, a man named Ray Kowalski was examining a box of .308 rounds with the unhurried attention of someone who had no urgent appointments and had learned over the course of a life that had required significant recalibration at several key intervals. That unhurried attention was generally more productive than its alternative. He was 58 years old, wide in the shoulders, with a gray beard trimmed close and eyes that had developed over 3 tours and 30 years of living afterward, the particular quality of stillness that belonged to people who had learned to observe before they committed to an interpretation. He had been a customer at Lone Star Arms for 4 years. He came in every few weeks, usually on Tuesdays, rarely bought anything. Walt had long since stopped wondering about this. Ray looked up when the door opened. Then he looked back down at the ammunition. But something in the quality of his attention had changed the way the quality of stillness in a room changes when someone walks in who matters. Though at this point, he could not have explained why he felt that. Something in the way she moved, something in the way she stopped just inside the door and spent 2 full seconds simply reading the room before she committed to entering it fully. Garrett's voice carried easily across the floor. "Can I help you find something?" There was nothing overtly wrong with the words. The tone was the thing, that particular calibration of helpfulness that communicated its precise opposite, the kind deployed by people who want credit for the offer without any inconvenience from the result. Helen set her rifle case on the floor beside the door. "Scope adjustment," she said, "and the elevation turret is reading 3 clicks high at 300 yards. We can take a look at that." He paused one beat too long. "Our gunsmith is backed up a couple days, so I'll wait." He had expected a different answer. He had expected the small retreat, the slight embarrassment, the decision to come back another time. The smile recalibrated. "Sure thing. Take your time. Have a look around." He gestured at the display cases with the expansiveness of a man indicating a kingdom he was fairly confident she could not afford. "Though if you're looking for something specific, you might want to browse the hunting section. More approachable options over there." Helen did not respond to this. She walked to the nearest display case and looked down through the glass at the rifles arranged inside. And then something happened that Garrett would not be able to explain clearly later, when asked to give a precise account of the sequence of events. Helen Carter stopped walking. She stood perfectly still, looking at the contents of the display case, and the quality of her stillness was so specific and so total that it took Garrett a moment to realize she wasn't browsing. She was reading. Not the price tags, not the model names on the placard cards positioned at precise angles alongside each weapon. She was reading the weapons themselves the way certain people read rooms, absorbing information at a rate that did not correspond to casual observation and suggesting a framework of reference that casual observation would not have produced. She looked up. "Third row," she said, "second from the left." She pointed through the glass with a hand that trembled in its steady mechanical rhythm. "That's the CQB variant. Modified buffer spring, the standard configuration wouldn't fit the housing at that barrel length." Garrett's smile didn't move. His eyes did fractionally. "Barrel length is 20 inches. She continued, her voice even and conversational, as though she were noting the weather on a day with uncomplicated weather. "Not the standard 29. Titanium firing pin, not steel. Magazine's been modified to hold 7 rounds instead of 10. Weight distribution issue with the original configuration under sustained fire at elevated temperatures." 4 seconds of silence. Because those specifications were not on the placard. They were not on the store's inventory sheet, which Garrett had committed to memory as a point of professional pride. They were not available in any catalog he had ever encountered, civilian, commercial, or trade. The weapon in question was on paper a custom display piece whose provenance had been documented carefully and whose actual technical specifications existed in documents with classification markings and distribution lists measured in single digits. The kind of details that required a specific and verifiable chain of authorized access to obtain, and that access was not something you stumbled into. Helen Carter had just recited them from memory while looking through a glass case with a hand that shook. In the corner, Ray Kowalski set the box of .308 rounds down on the shelf with the deliberate care of someone who has decided that what they are doing is less important than what they are watching. He turned his body at an angle that looked entirely casual and was not, and looked at the woman at the display case with the full, unhurried attention he usually reserved for situations where that attention was doing genuine work. His gaze moved to her right hand, the tremor moving through it in that measured rhythm. Then it moved to her wrist. There was a scar there, visible when she had reached forward to point, a small circular mark, pale and old, positioned in the specific place and presenting the specific shape of something that was not made by glass or a fall or a kitchen accident. The kind made by a bullet traveling at high velocity through soft tissue and exiting clean on the other side, the entry and exit wound, leaving their respective signatures in the scar tissue that formed around them in the months that followed. Ray Kowalski had a scar almost identical to it on his left forearm, and he understood precisely what the sequence of events was that produced a scar with that presentation. He did not say anything. He watched. He had been doing this long enough to know that the first instinct to speak was usually the wrong one, and that the second one was worth examining carefully before acting on. Garrett had recovered. The smile was back, broader now, with an edge that hadn't been there before, the particular brightness that emerges when a person feels that their territory is being questioned and has decided that doubling down on confidence is the appropriate response. He glanced at the other customers who had begun to drift closer, drawn by the specificity and the unexpected direction of the exchange. There were perhaps a dozen people in the store now. Several of them had their phones out with the anticipatory ease of people who had learned to document interesting situations before they were over. "Those are some very specific details," Garrett said. "YouTube videos? Or did you get all that from a video game?" The quiet laugh that moved through the small crowd was the sound of people choosing a side quickly, which was one of the less attractive things crowds did, but one of the most consistent. 3 more customers had come in from the street while the exchange was developing, drawn by the specific gravity that forms when something interesting is happening in a room, and the room has not yet decided what kind of interesting it will be. A woman near the back had her phone raised at the angle of someone who was recording and hoped no one noticed. A man in expensive tactical gear had stopped pretending to examine a scope to watch. The audience had the quality of a crowd that had arrived at a certain interpretation of events and was now invested in that interpretation being confirmed. Helen did not smile. She did not bristle. She did not take the bait in any form it was being offered. She looked at Garrett with gray eyes that had the quality of a fixed point on a clear day, steady, precise, measuring the distance to the thing in question, without investment in what that distance turned out to be. And she said, "I'd like to see the rifle. That rifle is $50,000. I know what it's worth." Garrett leaned against the counter with the comfortable weight of a man who has decided he is winning the situation and wants the room to notice. He looked at the other customers, let them settle in. He looked back at Helen with the smile at full deployment. You know what we've got arranged in the back? Best indoor facility in the state. You want to show us what you know, be my guest. He spread his hands in an open theatrical gesture, the gesture of a man offering something he is certain will be declined. One shot, anything on that range. You make it, I'll believe every word. It was designed to land as a dismissal, the kind of challenge that contains its own resolution engineered for refusal, and the particular species of laughter that follows the refusal of someone who has been called out beyond their actual capability. Helen Carter said, "Clear the range." Walt Greer had been listening from his office doorway since the second sentence of the exchange. He had come to stand there with his coffee watching. He had watched Helen Carter recite specifications that he himself had been required to sign a non-disclosure agreement to receive. He had felt something cold and clarifying move through him. Not alarm exactly, but the close relative of alarm that presents a sudden heightened attention, the feeling of a man who has been sitting in a room and realized that the room contains something he had not accounted for. He had been in the Marine Corps for 16 years. He had worked with people at the high end of what people could be trained to do, and he had learned in the process that the high end was not usually announced. It did not arrive with credentials displayed and context provided. It arrived quietly in ordinary clothes and made itself known through the specific grammar of how someone moved and what they saw and what they already knew before you told them. He had not seen it walk through his front door in 7 years of running the shop. He set his coffee down. He went to the range door and held it open. Garrett looked at him with the expression of a man expecting his manager to provide backup. "Clear it," Walt said. His voice had a quality it did not have in normal conversation, the quality of a direction rather than a request, carrying the particular weight of someone who was issuing it from a position of seniority over the situation rather than just over the person being addressed. The shooters already on the range came in from the back, curious and mildly put out the minor disruption of their afternoon practice, overridden by the more compelling pull of whatever was assembling itself on the main floor. They joined the loose orbit of witnesses that forms around anything that carries the potential to become a story worth telling. The target had been installed months ago as a running joke and had remained as a permanent fixture and an ongoing challenge to the store's most serious shooters. A silver dollar coin, actual silver minted 1972, suspended on 16-pound test fishing line from the target frame at the full extent of the range 500 meters out. The ventilation system created a faint persistent current that kept it turning slowly on its axis, catching the range lights in small, bright arcs as it rotated. The best shot Walt had personally witnessed had missed it by 6 inches. Several competitive shooters of real achievement had tried and come close and not hit it. Nobody had ever hit it. Helen looked at it for 4 seconds. Not with doubt, not with calculation, with the evaluative attention of someone confirming that what they are looking at matches what they expected to find. Then she set her bag on the shooting bench, reached inside, and produced a pair of shooting gloves. The leather was cracked at the finger joints, soft and very dark, with years of use molded to the exact architecture of her hands the way leather molds to something it has been in contact with long enough to remember. She put them on with the automatic precision of long habit, each finger seated in its place without her looking at her hands while she did it. Then she reached back into the bag and produced a wrist brace. It was not a standard medical device. The frame was carbon fiber matte black with micro-adjustable straps in a series of servo stabilizers positioned along the ulnar axis of the forearm. A medical engineer familiar with the relevant applications would have recognized it as adaptive equipment originally developed for fine motor control in extreme environments, the kind of work done at the intersection of aerospace medicine and rehabilitation engineering, and later adapted for a small and very specific population of precision specialists whose nerve damage was permanent, but whose occupational requirements had not changed to account for that fact. The prescription bottle she briefly revealed alongside it contained medication that no pharmacy in Texas carried without a category of specialized authorization that most pharmacists had never been asked to process. Garrett said something about arthritis cream. The remaining members of the crowd who were still inclined to find this funny found it funny. The sound their laughter made was smaller and less certain than the laughter that had come before. Helen did not look at him. She had stopped registering him as a participant in this particular moment some time ago. She knelt on the shooting mat slowly with the deliberate acknowledgement of someone who has accepted the limitations their body presents without having made peace with the fact that they exist and settled into it with the careful precision of fitting a specific and long-practiced shape. The crowd behind the glass was watching a woman with shaking hands prepare to fire at a target 500 meters away, which was what it looked like. What it actually was something that did not have a simple name. The convergence of 25 years of daily practice, the specific education of a body that had been required to find new answers to old questions, and the accumulated patience of someone who had learned at considerable personal cost that the distance between what was possible and what appeared possible was almost always larger than it first seemed. Feet shoulder width, weight distributed with the exactness of someone who has made this calculation many thousands of times. Center of gravity low and stable, and committed to the position. The rifle came up and she adjusted it by increments invisible from the outside, small and specific, the private language of a body that has been at this particular task long enough that the adjustments have migrated below the threshold of conscious decision-making. Ray Kowalski stood at the back of the gathered group with his arms at his sides. He was watching her breathe. She breathed in 4 counts, hold, 8 counts out. Her chest expanded and contracted with the disciplined regularity of someone who has used breath as a precision instrument for so long that the correct rhythm had become the body's unthinking default, as automatic as the heartbeat it was being used to govern. The tremor in her right hand was still there. It did not stop. It never stopped. It was not capable of stopping, but something in it had changed. It had synchronized with something. The metronome quality of it had come into alignment with the rhythm of her breathing, with some internal calculation she was running in a part of her mind that operated below language and was not available for observation from the outside. Ray Kowalski understood what he was watching. He had spent 30 years learning to understand what he was watching, and the most important lesson of that education was that the first interpretation was almost never the correct one. The first interpretation was the one your existing categories produced. The correct one required you to set those categories down and look at what was actually in front of you, look at it without the frame, without the assumption, until the thing itself told you what it was. He had applied this to terrain, to intelligence assessments, to people who were presenting themselves as something other than what they were, and to people who were presenting themselves accurately but being misread anyway. The second category he had found was more common and more consequential than the first. He had sat across a table from a neuroscientist in Bethesda 15 years ago and listened to an explanation of sustained combat tremor that he had mostly tuned out because at the time it had sounded like a description of someone else's problem. But one detail had stayed with him in the way that details stay when they are true and specific and have no obvious application until years later, when the application presents itself in cases of advanced nerve damage sustained through repeated high-caliber exposure over an extended period. The tremor was not random. It had a pattern, a frequency, a measurable oscillation with a minimum point that occurred at consistent intervals. And in certain individuals, very few representing the intersection of specific native aptitude with extraordinary and sustained training over many years, that pattern could be mapped and predicted and ultimately incorporated into a firing solution, the same way an experienced shooter incorporated wind speed or target movement. You did not fight the tremor. Fighting it was working against yourself. You waited for the pause. Every 4.7 seconds, the oscillation completed its cycle and reached its lowest point, a micro-interval of relative stillness in the ongoing movement, brief and reliable as a tidal pattern. Helen exhaled, waited. The coin at 500 meters turned on its line in the recycled air of the range, catching the light in its slow rotation, indifferent to the 15 people watching from behind the observation glass. The rifle fired. The sound in the enclosed space was percussive and absolute, the kind of sound that reorganizes your understanding of where you are and what is happening and how serious the moment you are in actually is. Several people stepped back without deciding to. The echo built and fell away. The coin rang, not swayed, not moved, rang the specific bright note of a small piece of metal struck cleanly at its center of mass by something traveling at the correct speed from the correct direction, a sound distinct enough and clear enough that 3 people in the group looked at each other simultaneously to confirm what their ears had told them. It was the kind of sound that carried its own information, that communicated not just the fact of the hit, but the precision of it. The difference between something struck at its center and something struck at its edge was a difference you could hear, and what they had just heard was the former. Somewhere in the gathered group, someone exhaled. A sound barely audible, the involuntary release of breath held without realizing it had been held. Helen cycled the bolt, waited, breathed. The second shot split the coin along its vertical axis. One piece fell and was gone. The other piece kept turning half its original size on the undamaged line. The crowd had gone quiet in the way crowds go quiet when they are watching something they had not prepared themselves to watch. Not the quiet of boredom or distraction, the quiet of people who have become uncertain about what they are witnessing and have stopped narrating it internally while they wait to find out. Garrett Nolan said nothing. His phone was in his hand, but he had stopped filming at some point without consciously deciding to stop, and he was not sure when that had happened. Helen made a small adjustment with her left hand on the scope, a quarter-inch compensating for the altered weight distribution of the half coin and the minute drift in the ventilation current that she had been tracking since she settled into position, tracking it by feel and sound, the way you tracked things you could not see directly when you had been in the practice long enough. Then she closed her eyes. Someone near the back of the observation area made a sound that was not quite a word. 8 seconds passed. Helen's breathing continued its cycle even and inviolable, unchanged by the audience behind the glass or the specific impossibility of what she was preparing to do. The tremor moved through her hand in its steady rhythm. The oscillation completed. The minimum arrived at the end of the 4.7-second interval, brief and reliable. She fired. The remaining piece of the coin ceased to exist. The fishing line swayed in the ventilation current. Nothing else was on it. The silence that followed lasted long enough to become something other than silence. It became the specific absence of response that forms when a group of people has encountered something that their available categories are not equipped to process. Not disbelief exactly, but the suspended state that precedes belief, reorganizing itself around new information. Phones came down. The loose performance of public mockery had not ended dramatically. It had simply run out of air and gone flat. The afternoon light came through the front windows at its low October angle and fell across the display cases and across Helen Carter as she rose from the mat, slowly the knees again, the same private negotiation she always conducted with the morning's accumulated demands, and turned back toward the main floor. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Walt Greer. Walt was standing in the doorway between the range and the main floor, with the history log of Lone Star Arms open in his hands, a thick, cloth-bound ledger dating back to 1995, its pages the particular yellowed color of paper that has been in the same place for a long time. He had retrieved it while Helen was on the range, knowing exactly where to look because he had looked at this specific page before years ago for reasons that were now resolving into a conclusion he should have reached sooner and could not have reached without today. He turned the ledger around and held it out. The photograph was black and white, the print quality of a film camera from 1998, the slight grain and tonal compression of film that has not been digitized and retouched, the honest record of a light source and a subject. A ceremony, military backdrop, formal posture, a group of figures in the specific arrangement of official commendations. In the center, a younger woman with the same gray eyes, the same quality of absolute stillness, in the presence of things that moved around her, receiving a commendation from a superior officer. The caption was typed on a small label below the photograph and had been there for 26 years without anyone understanding what it meant. Chief Instructor H. Carter, Training Excellence Commendation, Fort Bragg, 1998. Garrett Nolan looked at the photograph. He looked at the woman standing in the doorway of the range with her bag over her shoulder and her right hand moving in its unceasing rhythm. The photograph was 26 years old, and the woman in it had different hair and no visible tremor in her hands. But the eyes were identical. The jaw was identical. The particular quality of standing absolutely still in a room full of people who were moving was identical. Not stillness of inattention, but stillness of someone who had enough information about the room and had stopped needing to gather more. Walt closed the ledger carefully and set it on the counter. He did not make a speech. He did not gesture at the crowd or summarize what they were looking at for the benefit of those who were slower to arrive at the conclusion. He simply looked at Helen Carter the way a man looks at someone he has been trying to remember clearly for a long time, and he nodded once. The small, specific kind that contains a great deal more than its physical dimensions suggest. From the back of the room, Ray Kowalski watched this exchange with the full and quiet attention of someone for whom the last pieces of a long-considered question have just arrived at the same time from different directions. He understood now what he was looking at. He had heard the name before. Not in any official channel, nothing about the channels through which it traveled was official. It moved through the spaces between official channels in the particular transmission of men who had been trained by someone they were not supposed to discuss, who felt the specific shape of that original instruction in everything they subsequently did, and eventually needed to name its source even if the naming was quiet and private, and went no further than the conversation it occurred in. He had heard it in a bar in Fayetteville 11 years ago from a man who had been drinking carefully and talking more carefully still. He had heard it again in a hospital waiting room at Brooke Army Medical Center from a ranger who was 3 beds over, talking in his sleep about a range somewhere in Virginia, and a woman who could put 5 rounds through a quarter-size hole at 400 meters in wind conditions that would have sent most shooters back inside, and who could make you understand, watching her do it, that the distance between what you thought you were capable of and what you were actually capable of was a gap you had constructed yourself and could therefore deconstruct. The Phantom Ghost, present on every range at Quantico according to the stories in the sense that you never heard her arrive. You simply looked up at some point and she was there, and then at some later point she was not, and the shot you had been failing to execute for 3 days was somehow available to you. Ray Kowalski was not a man who deployed words like legend carelessly. He had spent too many years in a world that used them carelessly and had seen what that cost. He was thinking it now, privately looking at a 52-year-old woman in a denim jacket whose right hand shook with a rhythm he now understood was not a limitation but a record. A physical inscription of something specific that had happened in a specific place at a specific time, written into the nerve tissue and staying there, and every day since then announcing itself to anyone who looked at her hands with the kind of attention that could tell the difference between what a thing was and what it looked like. They had all been looking at the wrong thing. Above the range, 3 floors up, a security system was doing something it had not been designed to do. It was searching. Part 2. What was underneath? The photograph had been in the ledger for 26 years without anyone understanding what it meant. The crowd around Helen had shifted in the indefinable way crowds shift when the thing they assembled to observe has turned into something they didn't expect and aren't sure how to categorize. The loose performance of public mockery had not ended with drama. It had simply deflated the way things deflate when the premise they were built on turns out to be wrong. People were recalibrating in real time, adjusting the story they had decided they were part of, and that process was visible on their faces in the specific and uncomfortable way that recalibration always is when it happens in public. Garrett Nolan stood behind the counter looking at the photograph, then at Helen, then at the photograph again with the expression of a young man discovering that the map he has been using to navigate a situation was designed for a different geography entirely, and that the distance he has traveled in the wrong direction is longer than he would have preferred to discover. He opened his mouth. Walt said quietly and without emphasis, "Don't." Garrett closed his mouth. In the corner, Ray Kowalski stood in the particular stillness of a man who has been still in considerably harder circumstances than this and understands that stillness, properly maintained, is itself a form of attention that misses very little. He was watching Helen the way he had learned to watch things that mattered, without urgency, without predetermined interpretation, letting what was there be there before deciding what to do about it. Before Garrett could find an alternative response, the sound came from the stairwell. Rapid, purposeful, the sound of someone ascending stairs at a pace that did not belong to a Tuesday afternoon in a retail operation, the specific rhythm of a person who has seen something on a screen and is moving toward its location before the full implications of what they have seen have finished arriving. 3 flights taken at the pace of someone who had decided the elevator was not an option. The stairwell door opened. Colonel James Whitfield was 6 feet 4 inches and built in the manner of men who spent their 20s carrying significant weight through difficult terrain and their subsequent decades continuing to demand things of their body that most bodies would have petitioned against. He was 55 years old. He wore a suit that had cost considerably more than the circumstances he had just descended 3 flights of stairs to address, and it showed the wear of that descent in the specific way that expensive things show, the wear of urgency jacket, open collar, loosened the dishevelment of a man who had moved fast without any concern for what that looked like. He stopped in the doorway of the stairwell and took in the room. Walt at the counter with the ledger. Ray in the corner, the gathered crowd that had come for entertainment and found something else. Garrett behind the glass with the expression of a man whose situation has deteriorated faster than he can track. And Helen Carter standing in the center of it all with her bag over her shoulder and her rifle case at her feet and her right hand moving in its steady, unceasing rhythm. He looked at her for a long moment. Something moved through his face that was not one thing but several, arriving simultaneously: recognition and something older than recognition, something that had been waiting in a specific compartment for a specific key, and the key had arrived and the compartment was opening. He did not make a speech. He turned to Walt. He turned to Ray. And he said in a voice pitched to carry exactly as far as the walls of this room, no further, and with no performance in it, "I didn't walk out of Kandahar without this woman." The room absorbed this. It absorbed it in the specific way that a crowd absorbs something that requires them to rearrange everything they have decided about a situation. The woman with the recording phone lowered it. The man in the tactical gear stepped back. The people who had laughed at the arthritis joke looked at the floor, or at each other, or at the space between themselves and Helen Carter, and the look they were wearing was the particular look of people who have been wrong in public and know it and are in the early stages of deciding how to carry that knowledge. It was not the worst thing that had ever happened to any of them. It was also not nothing. Then he turned to Helen and said 2 words, "Instructor Carter." That was all. He stepped back toward the wall, crossed his arms, and made himself as small as a man his size could reasonably make himself in the clear recognition that the space in front of him belonged to someone else and that the best thing he could do for the moment was to not occupy it. Helen looked at him. Something in her expression shifted by a margin that was small and very specific, not softness exactly, but the particular thawing of a controlled surface when it encounters something that bypasses the standard defenses by being entirely genuine. Something that required no interpretation and generated no calculation. "James," she said. "Ma'am, I told you years ago about the ma'am." "You did," he agreed. "I never fully complied." It was the closest thing to a smile she had offered all afternoon, and it lasted exactly as long as it needed to before her expression returned to its default, not cold but precise, the face of someone who has spent many years looking at things at great distance and learned to focus on what is actually there rather than on what the available light and available assumptions suggest it might be. Garrett was looking at Whitfield the way an employee looks at a superior officer when the geography of a situation has rearranged itself in ways that illuminate the employee's recent behavior from a new and unflattering angle. The math was arriving on his face in stages, each one carrying slightly more weight than the one before. Walt picked up the ledger and returned it to the shelf behind the counter with the care you give something that has just revealed itself to be more significant than you had appreciated. Then he looked at Garrett and said very quietly, "We'll talk later." And the particular weight those 3 words carried communicated that the conversation they referred to would not be brief, comfortable, or without consequence. The afternoon light through the front windows had shifted. Outside, Commerce Street maintained its ordinary Tuesday pace, indifferent to the interior reckoning taking place behind the plate glass of Lone Star Arms. Helen was looking at the challenge coin display behind the register. Not the weapons in the cases, but the rows of coins under the glass, the unit insignias and deployment commemorations, the particular currency of a world that ran on its own economy of meaning. She touched the front of her jacket briefly. The coin beneath the fabric was warm from the day's wearing. She had kept both promises as long as they could be kept in the form they were made in. She had kept them fully and without compromise. She understood now with the clarity that the afternoon had been assembling toward that keeping them going forward would mean something different than keeping them had meant for the past 3 years, and that her father had known this. He was not a man who deceived himself about the nature of the people he loved. He had understood what he was asking her to walk away from, what the walking away would cost, and what the cost of that cost would eventually become. She was still carrying this understanding when the vehicles arrived. The store had been gradually returning to something resembling its ordinary state in the 20 minutes since the shots on the range. Some of the crowd had left. Those who remained had the quality of people waiting to find out what the next chapter of something was, aware that what they had witnessed was not yet complete. Garrett had retreated behind the counter with the expression of someone reviewing a decision they could not unmake. Walt had found small tasks to occupy himself near the counter in the specific way that competent people find small tasks when they are near something large and are waiting to see what it requires of them. James Whitfield had come down to the main floor with his hands in his jacket pockets and the careful patience of someone who understood that this afternoon was not finished. 3 of them pulling into the lot with the synchronized deliberateness of a procession that has no need to hurry because it has already determined its destination. Black SUVs, government plates, the kind of vehicles that communicated a specific category of official presence without advertising the specific nature of that presence. The doors opened. 4 people got out. They moved with the organized efficiency of people accustomed to operating as a unit, 2 in uniform. Leading them was a woman in her early 60s with steel gray hair, cut short, and the bearing of someone who had been carrying authority long enough that it had become structural, not something she wore, but something she was part of, how she occupied space and the space around her. Colonel Sandra Reeves pushed through the front door of Lone Star Arms without reading the hours posted beside it. She walked past Garrett without acknowledging his existence through the gathered witnesses, as though they were furniture, not with arrogance, but with the specific focus of someone who has identified what they came for and will arrive at it without detour. She stopped in front of Helen Carter. For a moment, they simply looked at each other, and whatever moved between them in that moment was not visible from the outside, the compressed communication of two people who share a context so specific and so dense that the ordinary registers of reunion are beside the point. 6 years, Reeves said. You knew where I was. You didn't make it easy. I made it straightforward, Helen said. You didn't like the answer. Reeves reached into the interior pocket of her jacket and produced an envelope. Standard government issue, thick paper sealed with a classification marking she had apparently decided was less important in this moment than the thing the moment required. She set it on the glass counter. The envelope had a date stamped on the outside. 2018, 6 years old, unopened. Helen's name on the front in the formal block print of official documentation. That arrived at Quantico the day after you submitted your retirement, Reeves said. The commendation you declined to wait for. The ceremony you didn't attend. She paused. 43 of your former students attended without you. Several flew in from overseas. Helen looked at the envelope the way she had looked at the photograph in the ledger, without surprise, with the particular quality of attention she gave to things she had known were still in the world somewhere waiting. She did not pick it up. Reeves reached into a different pocket and produced a second item. Not old, not black and white, not the documentation of a past that had settled. A digital print on standard paper dated 4 months ago, with the particular visual quality of surveillance photography, long lens, high compression, the texture of something captured at distance by someone not intended to be seen capturing it. It showed a street, European architecture, the specific density and age of Central European streets that are older than the countries they exist within. A man walking at a normal pace with the practiced alertness of someone accustomed to monitoring his surroundings without appearing to do so. His face was in three-quarter profile, but it was clear. Helen looked at the photograph for a long time. The man in it was walking at the pace of someone who had long practice at not appearing to be paying attention to his environment while paying close attention to his environment. It was a specific pace, and she knew it. She had seen it many times, had been the person responsible for developing it in some of the people who used it. The pace of a trained operative who has been doing operational work long enough that the habits of situational awareness have become indistinguishable from the habits of ordinary movement. You could not unlearn it. After enough years, it was simply how you walked, the way she simply checked windows when she entered rooms and noted exits before she needed them. Habits that had become structure. She was looking at the face. 25 years older meant lines she did not remember gray. Where there had been dark, the particular settling of a face that has been outside in difficult conditions for many years. But the structure beneath was the same. The jaw, the way the eyes were set, the specific quality of the three-quarter profile that the camera had caught alert without appearing to be present, without appearing to be watching. She knew that face. Sergeant Daniel Cross, Reeves said to the counter rather than to Helen, giving the information somewhere neutral to land. Official record, killed in action, Prague, December 1999. Body unrecovered due to structural collapse following the explosion. A pause. That photograph was taken in Prague 4 months ago. Our analysts put the probability of a facial match at 91%. When the room was very quiet. He is 25 years older, Reeves continued. Facial geometry within the margin of individual variation over that interval. There is a second image taken 6 days later at a different location in the same city. She did not produce the second image. She waited. Helen had not moved. She was running a calculation in the part of the mind that processes things too large and too fundamental for the sequential logic of words. 6 people in Prague in December 1999. 6 people in a safe house in the Žižkov district 4 days before Christmas, snow beginning on the cobblestones outside, and bad coffee on the table. And a mission brief that had seemed at the time like one more mission brief in a sequence that had been her life for 9 years. She had known all of them well, the particular knowing that comes not from ordinary time spent together, but from time spent together in circumstances where the difference between alive and not alive depends in part on the judgment and the reliability of the person nearest to you. Daniel Cross had borrowed someone's camera and said they needed something to remember this one by, and she had thought at the time that it was a sentiment she didn't need. She had understood later that it was the most important thing he did in the entire operation. 5 people had not come home. She had spent the years afterward finding ways to carry that sentence without letting it hollow out what came after. She looked up from the photograph. Where, she said. Reeves held her gaze for a moment. Then, with the specific exhale of a person setting down a weight they had carried to a conversation and discovered it was unnecessary, Prague, based on the pattern of the sightings for at least the past 18 months. She paused. The documents that surfaced alongside these images, we believe they explain what actually happened in that building in December 1999. And if they say what our preliminary assessment suggests they say, then what happened that night was not operational failure. The sentence landed in the room the way certain sentences land when they contain 25 years of unasked question inside them. Helen was quiet for a moment. Not the quiet of someone absorbing a surprise she had not been surprised, not entirely, not in the way that someone who has been living close to the edge of a truth for 25 years is surprised when it finally steps into the light. The surprise, if it was, that was in the form of it. The specificity, the fact that someone had assembled enough of it to say it out loud in a room that included other people. She had said it to herself in the honest part of herself for years. She had simply had no confirmation that she was saying it to anything more than the walls of her own discipline. Now she did. Walt Greer had not moved. He was present in the specific way that the moment required, available without intruding, bearing witness, without performing the bearing of it. He looked at Helen Carter with the face of a man who has spent enough years in the service to understand that the specific category of institutional betrayal being implied in that sentence was not exceptional, that it was familiar. That familiarity made it no smaller. Before Reeves could continue, Walt stepped toward the security monitor in the far corner of the store. He looked at it briefly, then turned the screen so that Reeves and her team could see it clearly. The camera feed displayed a still frame with the angular brackets of recognition software overlaid on one face in the crowd, a young man currently standing near the ammunition display 12 feet from where they stood. Declan Hayes was 22 years old. Brown hair, his father's jaw, the particular way of carrying himself that people develop when they are trying to be unobtrusive in a room full of people paying close attention to something else when the thing they are being unobtrusive about is significant. He had come into Lone Star Arms that afternoon to purchase a box of ammunition. He had stayed because of what he found himself watching. He had not expected to be watched in return. One of Reeves' team members moved toward him. He took one step back and then stopped, because stepping back was what you did when you were guilty of something, and he needed to decide how to be in this moment. And the decision resolved itself not through calculation, but through the simpler mechanism of exhaustion. The specific exhaustion of someone who has been carrying a secret that wasn't his to carry for a duration that has exceeded his capacity to continue carrying it. "I can explain," he said. His voice was steady in a way that cost him something visible. Reeves looked at the screen. She looked at the young man. She said to Walt, "What did he access?" "QSI personnel files, training records. 3 months ago from a residential address in Austin." Walt's voice held no censure in it, which was its own kind of information. "Legacy portal that has since been patched. Nothing removed. Nothing altered." He looked at Declan with an expression that was not unkind. He was reading. Reeves' hand moved toward her side. Helen was already moving. She crossed the floor with the unhurried certainty of someone who has made a decision before executing it, and she stopped between Reeves and Declan and did not look at Reeves when she did it. She looked at the young man. He was looking back at her with the face of someone who has arrived at the moment they have been dreading for 3 months and found now that it is here that it carries a strange quality of relief. The relief of something that has been postponed so long that its arrival, however difficult, is preferable to one more day of waiting for it. "Your father," Helen said. "Not a question." He swallowed once deliberately. "Sergeant First Class Thomas Hayes? He served under you, 2003 and 2004. His voice was even and cost him something to keep that way. "He died 14 months ago. Heart attack. He was 51 years old." A pause. "The official records are almost completely redacted. I tried every available channel, every FOIA request, every Veterans Assistance Office, every door I could find. Every door led to another closed door. And all I wanted to know, all I needed, was who he was, what he did, because he never told us. Not me, not my mother, not anyone. He carried it completely alone for 20 years, and then he was gone, and that part of him went with him." His jaw tightened by a degree. "So I found another door." The room held the particular silence that forms when something private is being said in a public space, and everyone present has the decency to treat it as private. Helen looked at him for a moment that was not short. "Thomas Hayes was the finest spotter I trained in that entire decade," she said. Declan Hayes went very still. He had a natural sense for wind that took most people 3 years to develop correctly. He had it in the first 6 months. Her voice was even, not gentle, not performative, just even the way things are when they are simply true and don't require any additional weight to be felt. In March of 2004 at Ramadi, his team was cut off. Communications down, compass damaged. He navigated 4 men out of a kill zone using a field compass, with a cracked housing and a radio that could only receive. 2 of those men had wounds that would have been fatal within the hour if they had remained in position. She paused. That action was never formally documented because the mission it was part of does not exist in any official record. But it happened. I know because Thomas Hayes sat across at a table from me when he came back and told me about it without embellishment. Thomas Hayes was not a man who embellished. Another pause. He was quiet. He was precise. He was exactly the kind of soldier that official records were not built to hold. Declan Hayes was not holding his face the way he had been holding it. He was 22 years old and he had spent 14 months trying to reconstruct a man from official documents that had been systematically emptied of the things that would have made the man recognizable. He had found dates and assignments and redacted field reports in a photograph from a training exercise in which his father was one of 8 men whose faces meant nothing without context. He had found in his father's effects a challenge coin he could not identify, and 2 books on navigation without bookmarks, and a handwritten note that said only check wind before you commit, which he had kept because it was the kind of thing a man might say to a son, even though it had not been said to him. He had built a version of his father from these things the way you build something from the materials available, which was better than nothing and less than what he had needed. What Helen Carter had given him in 3 sentences was more than 14 months of searching had produced. Reeves was watching Helen with an expression that had shifted from the guarded professional distance she had brought through the door into something that required more complex language to describe the particular respect of one person for another who has just done something that required more courage than the person watching has been called upon to deploy today. She lowered her hand. "I'll need a full statement," she said to Declan measured. "The breach requires documentation. Your device, your contact information, a formal interview." She paused. Given the scope of what was accessed and the circumstances surrounding it, the determination on charges will depend on cooperation. A brief glance at Helen. "I think cooperation is the direction." Declan nodded. He was not entirely present in the room. He was somewhere in the information he had just received, turning it over slowly, beginning the work of integrating it into the version of his father he had spent 14 months attempting to reconstruct from absence. Reeves turned back to Helen. 48 hours, she said. "There is a team assembling. They want your read on the Prague documents, not a summary, not a third-party interpretation of your read, yours, because you are the only person who was in that building and came out of it." She looked at the sealed envelope on the counter, at the surveillance photograph, at Helen. "I know what I'm asking," she said. "I'm asking anyway." Helen's hand moved to the front of her jacket, the coin beneath the fabric, warm and worn and full of weight that was not its own weight, but what she had assigned to it. She thought about the hospital room, the specific quality of her father's voice when he was saying something he needed her to have before he ran out of time to give it, the precision of the 2 promises she had made, and the intention behind each word. She thought about 5 people who had not come home. She thought about a man in a Prague street walking at a careful pace 25 years older than the last time she had seen him. Some promises held their original shape for their entire lives. Others held you until the moment came that was larger than the promise had been designed for, and then the promise either broke or became something else, something its maker had been preparing you for all along. Her father had carried a challenge coin through 23 years of service and pressed it into her hand at the end of it. He had known what was in the coin. He had also known what was in his daughter. "I'll need the full file in the car," she said. "Everything, not the summary. I want to read it before the briefing." Reeves allowed herself one small, precise nod. "It will be ready." Part 3. What remained? The room began to empty in the way that rooms empty after significant events in ordinary places. Not quickly, not dramatically, but with the gradual dispersal of people who have been present at something they will be adjusting their understanding of for some time. Some left immediately, returning to the ordinary trajectories of their Tuesday evenings. Others lingered at the edges, not quite ready. Walt had begun restoring order to the main floor with the quiet efficiency of a man who understood that the best response to extraordinary events in an ordinary space was to make the ordinary space ordinary again. Reeves and her team had moved to the range entrance. Declan Hayes sat near the window with a notepad writing a statement and probably something more personal, the 2 not easily separated at this particular moment. James Whitfield stood near the counter, jacket still open from the descent, watching the room with the specific calm of a man who has navigated enough complicated situations to know that the most useful thing in their aftermath is simply to be present without requiring anything. Helen crossed to the counter. The envelope was where Reeves had placed it, 6 years old, her name in block print, the wax seal unbroken. She picked it up. She did not open it. She held it and felt its weight, the specific density of paper and formal language, a record of something she had done, set down in the vocabulary that institutions use to describe things, which was always a translation and never quite the thing itself. A commendation. 43 former students who had attended the ceremony, she hadn't. Some of them from overseas. Standing in a room and receiving on behalf of someone who wasn't there something that was hers. She thought about Thomas Hayes returning from Ramadi and sitting across a table and telling what had happened without embellishment. She thought about his son, near the window writing assembling, from what she had given him the version of his father the official record had withheld. She thought about 5 families carrying 25 years of unanswered questions about what they were actually grieving. She reached into her breast pocket and took out the challenge coin. She held both the coin in one hand, the envelope in the other. The worn smoothness of one and the crisp formality of the other. The thing her father had pressed into her hand in a hospital room, and the thing her work had earned, waiting 6 years in the dark for her to be ready to hold it. She placed the envelope in her breast pocket against her sternum beside the coin, both of them together. The promise and the record. The past that had made her and the past that had cost her, and all the years of daily work that existed between those two things. Walt watched this from behind the counter. He did not say anything. The right response often required more discipline than the wrong one, and Walt was a man who had developed that discipline. The front door opened, and Garrett Nolan came back in. He had been in the parking lot for 90 minutes, long enough to read what there was to read about Helen Carter in the public record, which was not everything but was sufficient. Long enough to watch his phone tell him the shape of what he had done and the size of who he had done it to. Long enough to arrive at the end of the process of looking away from a thing and find that the only direction left was toward it. He looked different than he had inside the store. The performance was gone, the smile, the calibrated ease, the practiced confidence that had been the operating mode and had turned out to be built on a foundation it couldn't support. What remained was younger, less certain, more real. He stopped inside the door. He looked at Helen and said, "I didn't know in the way people say things they have rehearsed and discovered in the moment of speaking them, that rehearsal did not prepare them for. I know that isn't enough. I know what I said, and I know that not knowing what I was looking at doesn't make any of those things smaller." His hands were at his sides and nothing was performed in it. "I have been sitting in my car reading every publicly available record with your name on it. A Special Forces veteran wrote that you were the reason he came home. There were a lot of posts like that. There are also posts saying I don't exist," Helen said. "The internet is not a reliable historical record. The photograph in the ledger is real. 26 years of paper aging doesn't happen on a prop." He looked at his hands. "I called my dad from the car. He was Army Logistics one tour nothing like." He stopped. He asked why I was calling in the middle of a workday. I didn't know how to explain it. I told him I'd had a bad afternoon and wanted to hear his voice. He was not performing this. The absence of performance was audible in the specific evenness of it. "He's 63 years old," Garrett said. "He mows the lawn on Saturdays, and I didn't think about that today. I didn't think about any of it. That's the part I can't resolve, not that I was wrong about what I was looking at, but that it never occurred to me to consider what I might be looking at before I decided." Helen considered him the way she considered distances she was preparing to work with steadily, without rush, without investment in what the measurement turned out to be, because the measurement was what it was regardless of preference. He was 25 years old. He had done something genuinely unkind, with genuine enthusiasm in front of witnesses, and those were facts with real weight that did not become lighter because he felt bad about them now. They also did not define the totality of what he was capable of becoming, which was a different question and worth distinguishing from the question of what he had done. "There's a Veterans Resource Center on Bowie Street," she said, "about a mile from here. They are consistently short of people willing to show up and do the work that doesn't announce itself answering phones, driving people to appointments, sitting with someone who needs company without needing anything from that company in return." She held his gaze without pressure. They don't need someone who wants to feel better about themselves. They need someone who comes back the second week after the feeling has worn off, and the third. She reached into her lower jacket pocket and produced a small piece of folded paper. A name and a phone number in the spare practical hand of someone who writes things down for utility rather than sentiment. She held it out. He took it. "Tell him I sent you," she said. "He'll find you something real to do." Garrett looked at the paper. He looked up, and there was something in his face that was working toward something it hadn't reached yet. Something he might arrive at over time if he did the work the paper in his hand was pointing toward. He left. The door closed. Ray Kowalski, who had been examining the same rifle for the better part of an hour, set it down with the finality of someone who has finished something that was never about the rifle. He moved toward the door and paused beside Helen on his way out. The nod he gave her was brief and specific, the kind that communicated in the compressed language available to people who share a context. I saw it. I understand what it was. I won't diminish it by adding more than this. She returned it in the same exact measure. He went out into the evening without looking back. Reeves came forward from the range entrance. She had the bearing of someone who has completed the logistical portion of a difficult afternoon and is now orienting toward the next phase, which would present its own particular category of difficult. The team assembles at 0600, she said. Camp Mabry, Northwest Austin. I'll have a car here at 0430. She paused. The full file will be in the car. Everything you're read, not an interpretation of your read. Another pause waited differently. I went through it last week. 32 years in this work. I thought I had passed the point of being surprised by what gets decided in rooms where no one is accountable to anyone. She looked at the window and the dark street beyond it. I was wrong about that. Helen waited. The betrayal was institutional, Reeves said in the voice of someone who has been sitting with a fact long enough to deliver it without the heat of fresh anger, but has not found a way to make it feel smaller. A chain of decisions made by people with authority and with specific outcomes they needed, made in ways that could not be traced back to the decisions that produced them. Your team was the price of that outcome. They knew what they were sending you into. The room absorbed this. Did the review board, Helen started. The review board cleared you of wrongdoing, Reeves said, completely and honestly. Because you did nothing wrong, the board was not asked to evaluate the conduct of the people who designed the conditions you and your team walked into. She met Helen's gaze fully. That question is what the Prague documents answer. Helen looked at the floor between the counter and the window, the ordinary floor of a gun store on a Tuesday evening in Texas, and felt the weight of 25 years settle, not lighter, but more correctly held, more accurately distributed across the whole of what she was. 4:30, she said. Reeves nodded. Get some rest. It was in the circumstances a sentence that was almost entirely decorative. Helen said goodbye to Walt with a look that carried everything the afternoon had made available between two people who had navigated something significant together and arrived at the other side of it, understanding more about each other than they had at the start. He returned it with the contained acknowledgement of a man who would be thinking about today for a long time and had already begun. She said nothing to Declan Hayes. He was writing, still assembling his father from the pieces she had given him, and nothing was what that work required. It was his work, and it didn't need her. She walked out. The October night had completed the transition it had been working toward all afternoon. The serious dark was here, the kind that arrived after the last of the color had been spent, after the rose and gold were gone, and the city had settled into its electric version of itself, the specific orange glow of a large Texas city at street level, neither darkness nor day, but the particular condition of inhabited night. The wind had dropped entirely. The first stars were visible directly overhead, where the ambient light thinned enough to allow them. She drove home through streets she knew. She ate something practical and did not particularly taste it. She sat for a while in the kitchen in the dark, not because sitting in the dark was a habit, but because the light felt like more than the hour required. The kitchen was the place her father had stood with his coffee going cold, talking about things he needed her to have before he ran out of time to give them. She could see the exact place on the counter where he had set the mug. The place he had stood and spoken with the precision of a man who understood that time was finite and not to be spent on words that didn't carry weight. He had told her many things in that kitchen over the years, and she had absorbed them the way you absorb the things that are given to you by people who have earned the right to give them. Not always immediately, not always in the form they were delivered, but eventually and completely the way water absorbs into good ground. He had told her that the measure of a person was not what they did when the doing was easy, but what they chose when both available choices cost something real. He had told her that some burdens were yours to carry, not because you were the strongest person available, but because you were the person who understood what the burden actually was. He had told her that the promises made to the dead were the most important kind because there was no one left to release you from them. You had to know for yourself when they had been kept. You had to be honest enough to know the difference between a promise fulfilled and one abandoned because it had become inconvenient. She had kept both of hers fully and without shortcut. And she understood now, sitting in the dark of the kitchen with the coin and the envelope in her breast pocket, that he had known this moment would come. Not this specifically, not Prague and surveillance photographs. and Reeves through a door, but its shape. The moment when the promise would either have to transform or calcify into something that protected her at the cost of what the protection was for. Her father had pressed a challenge coin into her hand and asked her to come home. He had known what he was asking and what it would cost. He had also known what was in his daughter. She went to bed. She lay with her right hand resting on the nightstand where the coin and the envelope were placed, and she did not sleep for a long time. When sleep came, it arrived without drama, the way it comes to people who have learned not to require anything particular from it. She woke at 4 without an alarm. She dressed as she always dressed, functional layered. The denim jacket, the worn sneakers, the bag, the rifle case. The challenge coin in her breast pocket against her sternum, the envelope beside it. Their combined weight a thing she was already adjusting to. The car arrived at 4:29, dark blue sedan government plates. The driver held the door, and she got in. A manila folder sat on the seat beside her, thick with the physical weight of 25 years of accumulated documentation. Her name on the tab. Below it, a classification marking and a date range 1999 to 2024. She picked it up and opened it. The city moved past in the pre-dawn dark, Commerce Street empty, then the on-ramp, then the flat corridor of the interstate heading north. The headlights made their precise, limited illumination in the dark ahead. She read with the focused attention of someone for whom the words on the page were not abstract. They were the architecture of a night she had been living inside for 25 years, and reading them was not learning something new, but was the experience of watching a room she knew intimately be lit from a direction that had always existed but had never been available before. Page after page, the structure assembled itself. Memoranda with careful indirect language, the specific indirection of documents written by people who understood that directness created accountability, and accountability was precisely what they were designing around. Internal communications between offices whose letterheads she recognized with the cold clarity of seeing something suspected arrive in a form more concrete than expected. The decision chain rendered in the bloodless, passive voice that institutions used when they needed a record without a name attached to the record. The specific and documented knowledge of what they were sending her team into. The outcome they had needed and the way they had needed it, and the 6 people they had used to achieve it without having to carry what the achievement cost. She turned pages in the pre-dawn quiet and felt 25 years of weight acquire its proper address. The documents had the specific texture of things that had been assembled by people who knew how to assemble things carefully. The memoranda were precise. The communications were traceable. The decision chain was documented in ways that had probably seemed to the people constructing it like prudent record-keeping, and which now read as the unintentional confession of people who had believed the records would never be read in the light that was now being applied to them. She found the names of people she recognized, not many but enough. She found the specific language that authorized the specific conditions that her team had walked into without knowing the conditions had been authorized. She found the date. She found the signature. She turned the page without letting herself stop. She was 40 pages in when her phone vibrated. Unknown number. The kind that did not exist in any carrier database that required specific infrastructure and operational knowledge to route to a specific number through channels that were not supposed to be accessible to whoever had just used them. 4 words on the screen. Tombstone still breathing. She held the phone without moving. Tombstone was the radio call sign of Sergeant Daniel Cross, given informally in Helmand Province, after he walked out of an ambush that the casualty projections had not expected anyone to walk out of. She had been the one who first used the word standing in a doorway, watching him come back through the smoke, with the bearing of a man who had made his full accounting with the outcome and simply hadn't gotten around to implementing it. She had said it once, and it had traveled the way call signs traveled through the network of people who had been present forward and sideways and down through subsequent years until it became more permanent in certain contexts than the name on a service record. 5 people had known that call sign well enough to use it in context. 4 of them were confirmed dead. She was in a car at 4:40 in the morning, heading toward a briefing about Prague, and whoever had sent this message knew her current number and had sent it now, not last week, not 6 months ago, when the photographs were first found, but tonight within hours of her agreeing to go. Someone was watching the thing she was moving toward. They wanted her to know they were watching before she arrived. In the front seat, Reeves spoke without turning. She had been watching the mirror and had seen the screen illuminate. Everything all right? Helen looked at the message for another moment. She pressed delete. Someone knows I'm coming, she said. A pause. The highway moved under them at 65. Yes, Reeves said. I considered that possibility. You considered it and didn't say so. Telling you before you read the file would have shaped how you read it. You needed to read it clean. A pause that belonged to Helen. Then, the signal, what did it say? That the target is alive, his call sign, not his name, his call sign. A longer pause, the recalibrating kind. That's confirmation, Reeves said, or constructed bait. I know which one it is. You can't. I know which one it is, Helen said, because the call sign did not exist in any document. It existed in the spoken language of 6 people on a specific deployment in a specific year, and 4 of those 6 are confirmed dead. No file, no report, no debrief contains that word in that context. She looked at the dark moving outside the window. He is not drawing me into a trap. He is telling me that he has been waiting for someone to find what is in this folder as long as I have. He wants me to know what we are both going toward before I walk into that room. The car held this for a moment. And if you're wrong, Reeves said, then someone has done extraordinary work reconstructing the operational vocabulary of a unit that officially does not exist in order to set a trap for a 52-year-old woman with permanent nerve damage in her hands. She let that settle, in which case they are about to learn what 25 years of patience is actually worth. Reeves absorbed this with the particular quality of a senior officer receiving information that confirms a difficult decision was the right one. She did not say anything further. She had asked. She had her answer. Helen opened the folder and continued reading. Page 43. A memorandum dated November 14, 1999, 6 weeks before Prague. The letterhead of an office whose name she recognized with the cold clarity of a long-suspected thing arriving in irrefutable form. The language careful and institutional, and indirect in every way that mattered, and legible in every way that would now be required. They had known. Not all of them. Enough of them. Enough that the decision had been made and documented, and the documentation sealed for 25 years in the confidence that time was their ally, and that the people who might contest that confidence had been reduced to one, and she had chosen to be quiet. She turned the page. She thought about 5 families. 25 years of carrying questions that had no answers, because the answers were in a sealed file that someone had decided would remain sealed, because the people who would be damaged by its opening were still in positions where they could prevent its opening. She thought about what it cost a family to grieve someone completely when the manner of the death could not be discussed. When the official record said one thing and the few people who knew more said nothing because they had been required to say nothing and had honored that requirement because they were the kind of people who honored requirements, and the cost of that honoring had been passed forward to families who received folded flags and sealed records in a specific permanent species of incompletion. She had been one of the people who said nothing. She had said nothing for 25 years because she had had nothing to say that could be said, because what she knew she could not prove, because what she believed she had no document to point to. That was no longer the condition. The condition had changed, and the file open in her lap was the evidence of the change. She thought about the review board that had cleared her of wrongdoing completely and honestly without being asked to turn its attention toward the people who had designed the conditions that made a review board necessary. She thought about Thomas Hayes and his son at the window, and the 43 students who had attended a ceremony she hadn't, and the one who had sent her a note afterward that she still had somewhere, the note that said, "Only you would have been proud." She thought about Ray Kowalski setting down his box of ammunition and looking at her with the full unhurried attention of someone who had been doing this work long enough to know the difference between what a thing appeared to be and what it actually was. She thought about her father standing in the kitchen with his coffee going cold, talking about the things that mattered most in the language of a man who understood that precise language in the service of precise things was not a luxury but a form of care. She closed the folder on her lap. Her right hand rested on the cover, and the tremor moved through it, the rhythm. The record, the permanent inscription of 45 minutes in a burning vehicle in a country she had gone to in good faith, written into the nerve tissue, and remaining there, and every day since then, announcing itself to anyone who looked at her hands with the kind of attention that saw the difference between what a thing appeared to be and what it actually was. She had made peace with the tremor long ago. Not with what caused it, with the tremor itself, the fact and permanence of it, the way it had required her to learn her own body in a different register, and build from that learning something that served her differently than what she'd had before. She had stopped fighting it the year she returned to Quantico. She had learned the pause instead. She had built her technique around what remained rather than around what was gone, and what she had built from that was in the honest accounting of nearly 2 decades more accurate and more patient and more deeply understood than what she would have built without it. That did not make this burning vehicle acceptable. It made her capable of continuing in the direction that mattered. The tremor moved through her hand on the 43rd page of a 25-year-old file at 4:50 in the morning. The 4.7-second interval. The micropause at the oscillation's lowest point. The moment when the body's involuntary signal and the will's deliberate one came into alignment, and everything that needed to happen could happen with precision. She breathed in. She waited. She thought about a silver dollar coin suspended on fishing line in an indoor range, about the specific bright note it had made when struck correctly, about the fishing line swaying afterward in the ventilation current with nothing on it. She thought about the way a room sounded when a crowd that had come to watch a failure witnessed something else entirely and had to accommodate what they had seen into whatever they were going to do next. She thought about that process, the reorganization of categories, the revision of assumptions, the slow and sometimes uncomfortable work of seeing what was actually there, and she thought that it was some of the most important work a person could do, and also the work most consistently avoided. Outside the eastern horizon had begun the first preliminary work of pre-dawn. Not light yet, not even the suggestion of light, but a barely perceptible recession of the absolute dark, a distinction between sky and flatland that was theoretical now and would be undeniable in an hour. The stars in the west were still fully present. In the east, they had begun their slow and patient and inevitable concession. She opened the folder and continued reading. There was more to read, and she intended to read all of it before the car arrived at Camp Mabry. The people in that briefing room deserved her full and accurate account of what she had known and what she had seen in Prague in December 1999. And the people who were not in that room, the 5 who had not come home, the families who had spent 25 years carrying questions, deserved to have someone in that room who had read every word in this folder and knew precisely what she was there to do. The challenge coin rested against her sternum, warm from the long day and the night that had followed it. The envelope beside it, carried now in a different way than it would have been carried if she had picked it up 6 years ago, carried not as something owed, but as something earned and accepted and integrated into how she moved through the world. Her father had known. He had pressed the coin into her hand and trusted her to know when the keeping of the promise had completed itself and transformed into something that could only have been reached by keeping it first. He had trusted her to know the difference. She knew the difference. The car moved north through the last of the Texas dark. The highway was straight and flat, and the headlights made their corridor forward in the dark. Her hand rested on the folder. The tremor moved through it. 4.7 seconds. The pause. The alignment. She breathed in and waited for the pause, and in that brief interval, reliable hers built from everything the years had cost her and everything they had made possible, she was already ready. End.